Who are you?
Who am I? I'm Blake from this one perspective, but if we zoom all the way out, I believe that I'm a fractal of Source. When I was born, my intestines were actually on the outside of my stomach. They didn't actually give me more than 3 years to live. My whole dissertation was, does spiritual awakening parallel spontaneous cancer remission? Because I was like, well, someone needs to study this. Cancer didn't teach me how to die, it taught me how to live.
Is there one particular story or synchronicity that comes to mind?
This little tiny spider comes down about a foot in front of my face.
Have you ever experienced any sort of complete loss of faith?
Letting go is synonymous with trust. It's surrender, literally.
We're actually craving is the feeling that that thing is giving us. And so a lot of the personal growth experience or that kind of thing is basically, how do you start feeling that thing now?
I took a 4-gram dose. This portal opened up in front of me. I remember asking the guide, the medicine, how many times have I woken up? And the medicine just was like, you ask that every time.
As you were a Christian counselor, what led you to leave the church? Welcome to today's episode of Getting to Know You. I'm your host, Cameron Edward Benton, and on today's episode, I have the great pleasure of introducing you to Blake Suzelis. Blake is a cancer survivor, a holistic therapist, and a PhD candidate at Saybrook University, where he did his dissertation on the possible connection between spontaneous cancer remission, and the hero's journey, and the major arcana of the tarot. In this episode, we cover how Blake's own cancer diagnosis opened up his spiritual journey, the significance of the Devil Tarot card in the context of spiritual enlightenment, and how being a Christian counselor eventually led him to leave the church. Blake is an absolutely fascinating dude, and while we do explore his use of alternative approaches to his cancer treatment, nothing in this episode should be taken as medical advice or an endorsement by me. I'm just a random dude on the internet, and I'm just curious and asking questions about people's personal stories. So without further ado, here is Getting to Know Blake Suzelis. Who are you?
Well, I think it's an interesting question, right? Because, especially being a therapist, I talk about identity all day long, every day. But I think to answer that question, it's really asking the question of from what perspective do you want to know, right? Because it's even if you're saying, well, what is a tree? Someone who's standing under it, looking up at it, they're going to have a different perspective than someone climbing it versus someone standing on a mountain looking down at the top of it. So I just think I would say we're multi-dimensional. Who am I? I'm Blake from this one perspective, but if we zoom all the way out, I believe that I'm a fractal of Source. So and there's so many different ways that we can look at that. So anyway, yeah, that's who I am.
Awesome. I love that. I love that answer. You mentioned that you're a fractal of Source, and my last guest, actually, interestingly enough, he was I'm basically kind of like a fragment of God is the way that he said it, a piece of God. When you say that you're a fragment of Source, what does that actually mean? What is Source? What does it mean to be a fragment of Source? And how did you come to that understanding?
Yeah, great question. So, I've had someone actually use this analogy with me to share their perspective, and I really clung on to it. I really like it. So it's kind of like if Source or God, whatever name you want to put to it, doesn't really matter, is an orange, right? When you peel that and you split it up into all the different sections of the orange, right? Mm-hmm. It doesn't mean that any of those slices are any less of Source. It's just smaller fractals. But then when you take one slice and you open that up and you have all these other bits and pieces within that one slice, and you just kind of keep going down and down and down. And really, we can just kind of take that analogy and say that's kind of what we are, I believe we're all one, and we are just different perspectives of Source. How I came to that, now that's a whole journey. A lot of my research and, personal, professional, even, in my PhD program, I talk about the tarot, but I also talk about the hero's journey. And so it's these different spiritual quests, if you will, that you have to walk through these different steps or so to get you to a place where you remember who you are. You know, sometimes you can read it in a book or someone tells you these things, and it's kind of like stuck in the mind. But until you experience it um, in the body, right? This is kind of like making sure we're connecting the mind and the body. If we have only a belief, we're going to have this really internal dissonance between knowing who I am and feeling who I am. So we can't fully become this new version of ourselves until we have a belief, but also an experience, and that's emotional, because that's in the body. That's our memory. That's in our body. So anyway, it's a whole different journey, but
Yeah.
yeah, it's been about a 2.5 year quest for myself. And this all came after I was diagnosed with cancer. So yeah, that's
Yeah, well, you did your dissertation, kind of on, like you mentioned, like, is there kind of a connection between spontaneous cancer remission and like the hero's journey and the tarot, and you kind of talk about like this kind of similar quest of like enlightenment or experience of enlightenment through these different journeys, and how a lot of people who experience spontaneous remission have this very deep connection. I think it was like a high percentage of them experience what they would call like enlightenment in some way, shape, or form. Which it sounds like is that what you're referring to as an experience of oneness, of kind of realizing like who you actually are. So I'd love to kind of get into your own journey with that, where you I guess where you said maybe it started with cancer, or did it start like earlier for you with kind of getting to that place where you actually like experience that or discover that, or have you actually, I guess, discovered and experienced that yet, or is it still like more of a belief for you?
yeah. Well, I mean, if we kind of go back, you're right. I don't think we can really separate the story. We've got to really understand the full thing. So, like when I was born, um, my intestines were actually on the outside of my stomach when I was born. In the womb, they were actually formed on the outside of my abdomen, and this is called gastroschisis. And they didn't actually give me more than 3 years to live.
Wow.
And my mom wasn't okay with that, so she said she prayed about it, and she was led to this homeopath, and it just happened to be 15, 20 minutes away. And the name of the doctor was Dr. King, who actually has now a global homeopathic company.
Wow.
But just so happened to be like 20 minutes from where I lived at that point in northeastern Ohio. But she said that, once I started seeing him and he was giving me this different energy medicine or homeopathics, that's when my color came back. I started actually absorbing my food and started gaining weight, because that's the reason why a lot of these kiddos were dying at that time, was failure to thrive. And so even just to live through that, I always had this sense of like, I've got a mission to do here in this life. I
Yeah.
have a purpose. I was saved, if you will, for a reason. And so that definitely played into my faith journey in a big way, because I was like, what is my purpose, right? Like that's
Yeah.
where we're all trying to ask and figure that out at some point in our lives. But kind of grew up in the Catholic Church till I was about 18, then left and just kind of like, kind of floating for a little bit. And then I met my former wife, and we started going to the Evangelical Christian Church for 20 some years, raised all five of our kids in the church. But yeah, it was the last, well, I guess I should say, and then when I was about 30, I went back for my master's in professional counseling. And once I started counseling people, at the beginning I would actually consider myself a Christian counselor. And so I had a lot of Christians. I actually worked with a lot of Amish.
Oh
That was
wow.
about half of my caseload actually at the beginning.
Wow.
And so that was really interesting too, but it was faith and spirituality was a very big piece of it. Um, and the further I got along into my journey, um, I started recognizing how fear played a piece in our mental, emotional, even physical well-being, and then how that came out in some ways in religion and different things. And I was helping all these people with their fear and different experiences with churches and things like that, and trying to get them to loosen that up, to shift out of that. Um, and so it finally, at some point, I was like, I don't know if I can do this anymore for myself in the church. And it just so happened to be that at the same time, at that time, my wife, we decided at the same time, like, okay, we're leaving the church. And thank goodness it was at the same time, because that made it actually a lot easier. But then there was kind of this mantra I had: I'm not going to be motivated by fear anymore. Like, that was not going to be a motivator for me anymore. So I just decided, okay, well, I'm going to consume any type of information I've ever wanted to consume before, right?
Mm-hmm.
You know, in the Christian evangelical church is like, basically you have the Bible and that's your book.
Right.
And so for me, I was like, I know there's got to be so much more out there. And so I started diving into even channeling and tarot and like just all sorts of things because I was like, it sounded interesting. And I was just kind of following those interests in whatever way I wanted to. Um, but it led me to certain books and understandings and teachings. And then I started meditating every single day and started having some pretty um, spiritual experiences in that way. Um, which then eventually led, I think, to the separation of my former wife and I. And I was, at that time, that's when I had a major surgery. Like I said, on my abdomen. Uh, it was kind of like I had gotten down to about 128 pounds at that point. I'm
Wow.
6'1", and so it was just like I wasn't absorbing food. I was eating about 4,000 calories a day and still losing weight.
Wow.
And so I knew that I needed to have another surgery, so I finally had that surgery, but I also had some other things going on, symptoms, and literally on the way to get surgery. So this was August 16th, 2021. I got a phone call from my PCP, and she's like, Blake, I'm sorry to tell you, your lab work came back, and we're going to have to diagnose you with chronic lymphocytic leukemia. And I'm like, I'm on the way to surgery, right? Like,
Wow.
and so it was a pretty, I would say those next 4 months were probably the darkest time of my life. Like,
Mm-hmm.
I mean, having suicidal thoughts and just like I was in chronic pain after the surgery. And, but at the same time, I was still diving in deeply into this spiritual journey because it just felt like it was something to cling on to in some ways, and it was almost like I had this craving that it just couldn't be satiated, just anything I could get my hands on, whether it was a podcast or book or whatever it might be, just kept consuming, and so eventually, I would say even. Kind of hesitant to say this on the podcast, but I would say
Mm-hmm.
plant medicine called me. It's not anything that I ever thought about before, and but it called me, and I started using that periodically as part of the spiritual experience. Um, and eventually, how I told you about kind of connecting the mind to the body, that was the key for me to be able to connect the belief and understanding of quantum physics and oneness and all of these things from a mental perspective, but then to have that spiritual experience and feel and remember who we are and who I am, like that was next level. Um, and so, kind of bring this all back to the cancer journey and all of that. I just thought, okay, I'd started doing some preliminary research on spontaneous cancer remission and started reading all the books, Dr. Joe Dispenza,
Mm-hmm.
Bruce Lipton, all the people I could kind of get my hands on. And so it just kind of was then my new journey to show people what was possible. I knew it was possible. I was reading this in books that people were being diagnosed with all sorts of different kind of cancers, but then healing their bodies. And I was like, okay, there has to be. This isn't just a miracle. It's not magic, right? Like there is a reason for these things to happen, and it's just science might not have caught up to what that answer is yet. And so
Right.
that's what kind of I kind of took on the quest for myself and for all of humanity, right?
Yeah.
um, but yeah, so following a little bit further, that's when I started doing I got to the point in my PhD program whereas like it was time for the dissertation, and I was like, well, this is a no-brainer. Like, so let's go ahead and do this. Um, and it was interesting because there really wasn't a lot of research done on spontaneous cancer remission,
Mm.
which just was kind of puzzling to me, right? Because I mean, you
Mm-hmm.
think this is some possibility, but no one's really diving in to study it. Um, well, I should back that up because that's not 100% true. I would say studying it from a quantum physics perspective or a holism perspective versus
Mm.
more that scientific materialism or Newtonian physics perspective.
Mm-hmm.
And so that's kind of where I dove in. And for myself, I realized like about I don't know, a year and a half into my journey of healing and spiritual awakening, um, that I was kind of, we'll just say, called, like to look at the tarot and try to understand that more, because I dabbled a little bit but didn't really understand it.
Mm.
Um, and then when I started listening to one particular perspective, and that's where the major arcana, which is kind of 22 archetypes, right?
Mm-hmm.
Versus the minor arcana, which basically is our regular playing cards now,
Mm-hmm.
right? I mean,
Yeah.
just, ace to king. Um, but the major arcana, if you put it out step by step, there's this whole like 3-line approach to spiritual awakening.
Mm.
And I realized I was about halfway through my own journey, and I realized I had gone through every single one of them previously. So I'm like,
Mm.
okay, there's something here, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so that's when I was like, I started using that as a way to pull me forward to the next step. And it was just like,
Mm-hmm.
it helped me to understand what was to come. But also, like I said, I'd already seen what I had already gone through as a
Mm.
way to understand this journey. And so, anyway, my whole dissertation was, does spiritual awakening parallel spontaneous cancer remission?
Mm.
Because I was like, well, someone needs to study this.
Yeah.
And so that was kind of my whole question going into this dissertation. And I didn't have an answer, honestly. I was like, I know my experience and I've had healings and certain things. And from the beginning, when my former wife and we separated, like my oncologist, he wanted to put me on medication for leukemia. And I was just like, I'm just not ready for it. Like it's like one of those things that when you get on that train, it's really difficult to get off.
Yeah.
Like you just start taking that medication, and you kind of in some ways become dependent on it until you get to the place where you have to do chemotherapy or radiation or
Right.
something like that. And I just wasn't ready. And so to this point, I have not had to use any medication, radiation, chemotherapy, nothing like that.
Mm-hmm.
And so it's a personal healing journey,
Mm-hmm.
but also kind of bringing everybody along in the scientific world to see, like, is this a thing? Because it was like I was having these understandings from a spiritual perspective, and I wanted to see how that aligned with science, or at least where we are now in science. Because like right now, I don't see that there is to me they're one and the same. These things we call spiritual, they're just science that we haven't really understood yet. you know so for example, like if we even kind of come to physics for a second, like we call this thing energy that can never be destroyed or created. But if we go into the spiritual realm, we could also call that God or source, right? Like we say, God's everywhere. It can't be destroyed, created, right? Like, I mean,
Mm.
why does there have to be a break between those two? I don't think there is. So I know I went on a big tangent there, but
No, you're good. You're good. I have like several different questions, so I'm
yeah.
almost like pondering where we're gonna go. But I think what sticks out to me initially is like I even noticed like at the beginning of your path, like pre your own decision making, right? Your mom was like, "Hey, we're gonna go down this alternate route of homeopathy," and whatever happened there, you are alive today and thriving. You lived a lot past 3 years old. It looks like, best I
Yeah.
can tell. Um, And, I think homeopathy is something that is, seen as not like scientific by a lot of the community or a lot of those things. So like, I guess if you're kind of like just unpacking that a little bit from the audience, like what is it you think happened, or like what worked or what didn't work, or like what was actually going on there, you think? And like, what do you think maybe needs to be discovered a little bit in there as well?
Yeah. Oh, these are such great questions. So homeopathy, I called it energy medicine for a reason. The basics of homeopathy is like cures like, and it's all based on quantum physics from Germany. And so they were saying that, well, at our base, we are frequency. Like that's what everything is a frequency. It's at the lowest level we can be, which from a Christian perspective, it's really funny because they say what? God spoke everything into existence. So, I
Mm.
mean, like, there isn't any contradiction even there, I don't think. And so, homeopathy is literally just a certain frequency that you are taking for your body to come back into balance. And so, that's
Yeah, I have like I guess a question on that. Like when you say it's a frequency, like what does that mean? Like that it's a frequency? Like are they like vibrating at a particular level and then they give you like a pill that's like at that level? Like I've never done homeopathy, so I have no
yeah.
idea. Like what does this actually like mean to be like, oh, this is a frequency and you're like being matched energetically with said frequency?
Well, just like you said, there is
Mm,
like frequency. I don't know. I'm probably going to mess this up in terms of like a hertz,
mm,
or whatever it is. There is a specific wavelength and frequency
mm,
of the medicine. So, for example, like I literally have some right here, and this is my the lymph drops that I'm taking right at the moment, um,
mhm,
and you were trying to match the, like I said, the frequency of the energy of that to what it is that I'm imbalanced.
mm,
So, for example, at when my mom kind of took me to the homeopath, she got interested because she's like, okay, my son's changing. Like, there's got to
mm.
be something to this. I don't understand it, but I'm going to study it. So she actually has been a homeopath now for like 40 years.
Wow. Like she
So
practices, or she's like just uses the medicine herself?
no, she practices. She's
Wow.
been seeing clients for, yeah, like 40 years. Um, my oldest brother, kind of this journey of mine and my mom's kind of spurred a whole trajectory in my family. So my
Mm,
oldest brother, he's a naturopathic doctor. My second oldest brother, he's an osteopathic doctor. So he's an MD with
mm.
who went through osteopathic
Wow.
training as well. Um, but then I was third, and so I was like, well, okay, we got the physical stuff covered. We need to do some mental and emotional. So
Yeah.
I'm going to be the therapist, right? But just to try to understand, how does this all fit together? But yeah, so to be able to, I guess, even understand homeopathy, again, you kind of do have to understand a little bit between Newtonian physics and quantum physics, right? Because Newtonian physics is this idea of basically you have matter, so what you can see, right? And then you have certain forces that we know we can measure, like electromagnetism, and physics talks about the weak force and the strong force, and gravity, right? Like these are things that we can kind of measure, but that's it. Like there isn't anything beyond that in Newtonian physics, and this is where the whole allopathic model comes from, and also scientific materialism, which is how we research things.
Mhm.
Okay, so all three of those things kind of fall in line and or kind of go downstream from Newton. Those two things come downstream from Newtonian physics,
Right.
where quantum physics, this is based on energy creates matter.
Mm,
Okay, and so there is this thing we call energy that then manifests in matter. So, for example, um, have you ever experienced an emotion before?
Yeah. Yeah.
Okay, just a couple times, right?
Yeah.
So if you happen to get really anxious about something, okay, we call emotion, right? I call it energy in motion. It's
Mm,
something your body, it's like something's created and then it needs to be released. But if we're not releasing it and that energy is not moving, it kind of gets stuck or blocked up in your body. So, for
mm,
example, if you've got a lot of anxiety, and you're not releasing it, it can create stomach aches,
mm,
chest pains, anxiety attacks, you could have numbness, you could, I mean, like, all the way to seizures. I mean, like, there's no end to what that particular emotion can manifest in your physical body.
Right.
And so this is kind of more of the understanding from a quantum physics perspective that we have this, or, you know, if we can call it energy, we call it chi, we can call it all sorts of different things,
Yeah.
right? But it's this thing that needs to constantly be moving, and it's there to help us learn and grow and evolve. And so quantum physics kind of flowing downstream from that, we have this perspective of holism, because in quantum physics, everything is connected, right? Everything is entangled. And so you cannot just separate pieces of the whole and study them separately, which is what we do in scientific materialism. We're like, okay, here's the brain, this goes to the psychologists, right?
Mm-hmm.
Here's the body, this goes to the MDs.
Mm-hmm.
But it's like, but they all influence the whole. Like, there's
Yeah.
feedback, and I mean, if you're doing neurofeedback, you understand this, right? Like, and so we have to see the whole, and that's why we call it holism. So it's, you cannot separate one piece or one part. You have to look at all the different quote unquote dimensions of a human, and how all of them are influencing each other. And this is where kind of naturopathic medicine and all these different type of holistic practices came from. So does that make sense how the flow is?
Yeah, no, it totally makes sense. I find it fascinating because I think that there's so much with what you said that makes sense in the realm of, like, I read this book that kind of gave a brief overview of how through the scientific method, one of the downfalls that has kind of happened through that, right, is because these different silos have become so separate, as they become like more deeply researched, in particular, where, you know, the psychotherapists are not talking with the neuroscientists, and they are a little bit more now. I think we're becoming like a more integrative and
Yeah.
kind of connected piece, and kind of people are looking at things from like, okay, how do these branch out or interconnect or intersect? But we kind of lost that like holism approach, but gained a lot of other benefits from that, right? And so I think we're starting to put those pieces together, but there's a lot of things that we don't know. And I would say to any audience members that are like, okay, like homeopathy, all this stuff, it's just like BS, and like there might not be the validated research that we maybe would want or need or whatever from our current scientific method or understanding. But at the same time, we have to look at things, I think, like the fact that you are alive, and the fact that you are existing through all this stuff, and the other stuff wasn't working for other people to keep them alive, and thriving like you are now. And so maybe it's completely coincidence, but the reality is like you did this thing and you are alive and thriving today, and that's worth noting, right? And not
Yeah.
throwing things away. I think one of the things that we have often done that I think doesn't serve us is we often kind of toss away things that don't fit our current understanding of like the universe or reality, or whatever it is. It's like, even when we're saying, hey, 85% of people are XYZ, it's like, well, okay, but there is the other 15%, and like if we don't factor that into the equation, we're not looking at the problem correctly.
Agreed. Absolutely agreed on that one. Um, yeah. Yeah, I know. We can kind of go down this rabbit hole for a long time.
Yeah. Well, I'm happy to. I guess, like, wondering from your perspective, like being raised like on homeopathy, keeping that alive. Like, how do you feel like that did change your perspective, even just like at a very young age, with the other people going around you? Were you being told that was like just not true and that you were alive for other reasons, or like what was like kind of your experience of that growing up, and how did that shape you?
Yeah. Yeah, it's so interesting because that was my normal, right, growing up. So I didn't really know a whole lot other than that for a long time until I, got into being in high school or college and things like that. And so, I mean, homeopathy, that was just, I mean, I just knew, hey, if you get sick, you take this. If you get hurt, you take this. Like, I didn't question it. I just did it. And, like, for example, there's one homeopathic called Arnica montana, and it's specifically for healing muscles, and specifically more muscles. But there was one time I was a freshman in high school, and I was playing baseball, and to this day I still don't know how this happened, but I was stealing third base, and I was sliding into third, and my wrist kind of got caught up under me somehow. And like as soon as I hit the dirt, like I knew something was wrong. And so, made it to home base, but then the next day we went, well, actually, I think I just started taking arnica. My mom was already basically waiting at home plate for me, like with the arnica. And so I was taking that all weekend, and then I was like, okay, it's not fully getting better. We went to the chiropractor to get an x-ray on Monday. That was like on Thursday or Friday or something. And he's like, okay, I looked at your x-rays, and he's like, well, I don't see anything but like about a 5-year-old fracture in that wrist. And it was just like, I've never fractured that wrist. I never heard it in my life. And so it's like, there was, again, more evidence as to something is going on here, Now, a lot of people will say, okay, energy medicine, that's all based on placebo. And truth is, I think that we don't use placebo enough. I mean, the pharmaceutical companies have figured this out, that like that's basically what they are competing against. As long as they can beat the placebo effect, then they can put a drug on the market. Right?
Yeah,
So,
no, that's a good point.
but I'm a hypnotherapist, and it's like using the placebo effect can actually really help people. But is that the only part of it? I don't think so. And I think that even my dissertation and research show that, because I went into it thinking like our intention is going to be like the number one thing that's going to influence our healing, and our beliefs about that. And it's just like, it is a piece of the equation, but it's not the whole picture. Again, there's so much more to it than that. And so, and just like with homeopathy, I think that there's a bigger, broader picture to that. For example, when someone is much more, we'll just say clean with their body, diet, environment, like mind, emotions, when everything is just working in a more clean environment, they're not using a lot of substances, things like that, I think they're going to find that homeopathy works better for them too, because it's more of a subtle medicine. It's not something that it's like, okay, you take ibuprofen versus homeopathic. Like the ibuprofen is going to work really fast, and you're going to feel it kicking in, where homeopathy is working on a slower, subtle, more energetic level, and it's just a different way of doing things. But the belief system behind it is you're accessing the root issue, which is, again, energetic, which will then manifest in the physical body in a different way, which, like I said, I've experienced that, and continue to experience that. But again, is that the only piece? Is homeopathy the only piece? Of course not. Right? So it's, again, we can't say any one piece, I think, is the only factor.
Yeah.
And to me, like, that's why I thought this whole spiritual awakening journey was so interesting, because to me it incorporates all of it. Okay, so for example, in my research, researching, like, there's a doctor in Taiwan, Dr. Shu. He's been actually working with cancer people, chronic illness, for years, I think actually over a decade. And I saw him as a patient as well. But his research, like, he has the most people who have ever experienced spontaneous cancer remission in research. There's been about 8 documented cases, and that's when I actually asked him, I was like, so how many people have you helped, with experiencing spontaneous cancer remission? He's like, I don't heal cancer, we help to heal bodies or something like that. And so I was just like, oh, so he's not going to give me an answer. And I was really bummed, but because I was really hoping to have a number for my research. But anyway, he still has the most individuals by one doctor in research who've experienced that. And so I was like, okay, again, there's something to this. But his approach, and I think my research and what I've seen in myself, parallels that. So there's this kind of a 3-phase approach to healing the body. And the first phase, and again, recognize there's no right or wrong to any of this. It's literally part of the process. Okay? You go through all of this. It's kind of like growing. You can't just skip an age, Even though we might want to skip middle school, it's just, but you still got to go through it. But phase one, this is very external. Okay, it's I'm going to the doctors, they're there to fix me. Right? It's all my power is external, if you will want to say it that way. So that's phase one, and when you get that diagnosis and you hear you've got cancer, like, what is the word that most people equate to cancer?
Probably death.
Death, exactly, right? Like, you can ask anybody, and that's what the word they're going to say. And I'm trying to also change that because I don't think it's accurate. I think cancer didn't teach me how to die. It taught me how to live. And so, like, it's completely different than what we think. So anyway, I see it as a teacher. But phase one, very external. Phase two is where it's like, okay, I'm going to my own body, taking responsibility for my own body. So I'm going to start working on, physical activity and diet, and I might do some holistic therapies and different things like that. But it's me taking responsibility for my body. Okay, so that's phase two. And then phase three, and this is the hard work. This is where we go internally, and we're working with the mind and the emotions and the energy, and we can kind of take this even deeper if we want to take that. It could even go to past lives and other things like that. So it's, we're working internally and going as deep as we can to kind of release and free ourselves of all those. Some people will call it karma. I call it just emotional attachments to the past. And once we can free ourselves from those, you're freeing your body from dis-ease. So.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, there's so much there. I mean, one of the things you mentioned kind of earlier, and even with that aspect with karma, is there's a psychiatrist online who talks. His name's The Healthy Gamer. I've talked about him a few times on my podcast, but he talks about, like, in Eastern tradition, there's this idea of like a samskar, which is basically this kind of scar in your, like, sort of psychic energy or your psychic field that can come from, like, your lived experience now, or comes from past previous, like, energetic things, like in either past lives, or, and some might say, like, passed down through, like, maybe your genetic code in some way, shape, or form. But it is through, like, healing these things that we kind of, like, unlock. You talked about, like, kind of moving that energy earlier, right? We start to able to separate this stuff, clear it out, create space, and, like, for a new energy or a new way of being. And because that samskar creates this, like, repetitive pattern of behavior or experience or whatever it is. So when we're able to release that, we move through that. And it is interesting to me, like, how that seems to really mirror, like, our current understanding of trauma, right? Like, when we look at things like Body Keeps the Score, or a lot of the work that's being done around trauma, and how it does affect our psychological field, but also our physical body. And we have all these conditions, and we can, if you look at, like, Dr. Gabor Mate's work and stuff, right, connecting to all these little pieces with how he can kind of trace, like, oh, like, you have this condition. I know I can basically tell you what your childhood was like based off the condition that you currently have, which is fascinating. We're starting to, like, explore and study these things more, and I hope we get to more and more understanding, and I think, like, different fields speaking with each other, because I think when I started getting really into the biohacking space, you and I were talking about that beforehand, and then, that was really popularizing, I think, through podcasts and that kind of thing for a while, and still is. But now a lot of the kind of traditional medical field has come more online through podcasts and that kind of stuff. And what I'm liking is that, like, these fields are starting to talk to each other, and we're starting to learn a little bit more about where maybe the gaps are in both understanding, or why maybe even with the correct original scientific understanding might be more accurate in some ways, but it also explains why these other things were working effectively for certain people, like, even when it comes to diet or different things. Like, I've been recently listening to Dr. Mike Israetel, who's a huge kind of, like, does a lot of exercise science stuff, and he's really explaining why a ketogenic diet might really work for some people, because it does these certain things, even if it's not necessarily, like, encouraging actual, like, faster fat loss or any of these things that we're not seeing, that's different from a calorie in, calorie out aspect of things. It's still using certain principles that allow you to basically eat less easier because you're fuller, or you feel better on fats, or you're just kind of eliminating all these other foods that might be higher calories through that process, right? And so I think we're getting closer and closer to these different understandings, and, like, bridging the gap of these complex ideas and like filling in the gaps of understanding like why you are alive. Why does spontaneous cancer remission happen? Why are these things happening that kind of don't fit within the current scientific model? So I really appreciate that you've done that work. I am curious, like what is it that brought you think, specifically to tarot and like using that as a connection piece with both spiritual enlightenment and then wanting to connect that with spontaneous cancer remission?
Well, I think when I started just letting go of my entire evangelical Christian religious background, that was just something that interested me, but it was not this deep interest. It was kind of like my former wife; she was more interested in it, so we started listening to a podcast together on it, and I was like, "Oh, this is really cool," you know. And it was a way for me to connect with her too, and we'd have fun conversations. So I'd keep listening to it, but it was just like, it was cool, but it's not a super super deep interest until okay, so what happened was I was in Peru. I went down there for 2 months as part of this whole journey, and I went and did an ayahuasca journey and came back. And about a few days later, I was literally just sitting in this little tiny studio in Lima, Peru, and I just heard like, you need to study the tarot. I mean, like it was just a knowing, like, okay, this is something I've got to do. It came out of nowhere, like so many other synchronicities in this path have come.
Yeah.
And that's funny enough. That podcast that I said that my former wife and we listened to together. She put out an episode literally the day before on the 3 lines of the tarot. And so that's when I was like, well, let me just listen to this, because I mean, it was exactly what it was that I felt like I needed to hear at that moment. Then I really dove in because I was like, oh my gosh, like this has been my journey. Like, I mean, I'm following this journey, and so Joseph Campbell, to me, it's a real parallel to the hero's journey, which he created in 1949 in his writing there. But it's a parallel to the journey through the major arcana of the tarot. And Carl Jung talks about these different archetypal shifts through the tarot. And so to me, there seemed like there was enough evidence, even like if Carl Jung's talking about it too, I thought, okay, so I'm not alone in this and seeing something, and so I was just kind of trying to put all the pieces together. And again, I was seeking hardcore. Right? Like, there wasn't anything that I was going to say no to. If it came to me, I was going to consume it. Just be like, okay, take what I need, and then I'm going to toss what doesn't work. But the Tarot Major Arcana, that was something that continued to resonate and still resonates. I use it with clients who are open to it. And it's really neat for them because they're like, okay, I know where I'm at in the journey, and I know what's next, and I know what I need to be working on to be able to step into that next step. And so to me, it's nice to have that kind of a map, because when you're starting to dive into the phase 3 of healing your body, it can be very overwhelming. Right? It's like walking into a library and looking for one book when there's no way. I can't even remember what they're called, the decimal system or whatever those are called.
The like tracking system within the library.
Yeah.
Yeah. I forgot about the Dewey Decimal System.
Yeah. But yeah, so it gave me a map, and since I already saw my own journey following that path, I mean, I could tell you specifics and synchronicities and stories, and it's just like, it's pretty wild.
Yeah. Is there
my
one
experience.
one like particular story or synchronicity that comes to mind?
Okay, so one in particular, this was actually kind of a fun one. So I was actually in Italy, and I was just journaling, like overlooking this lake, and I was sitting on a bench underneath this tree. And as I was studying the tarot for my research paper, I was also studying for myself at the same time and trying to understand it. Like, I was reading the books, but then I was using my experience to understand it in a different way. And the reason why I say that is because when... so I said there's 3 lines to the tarot. When you get to the 3rd line, if I'm being honest, I don't think anybody has actually captured that line fully. like to truly understand it and write about it. Like I've read books on it, and it's like, it's almost like you can see that they've never actually experienced it. Once you've experienced it, you're like, okay, they don't understand it fully yet. So I felt like that was also something I was researching to be able to, again, give that gift to the world as well. So the first card in the third line is the devil card. Okay, and again, growing up in a Catholic and then evangelical Christian church, the devil is like, if you pulled the devil card in a tarot reading, like, and you didn't know anything about it, you'd be like, oh crap,
That's not good.
this can't be good, right?
Sure.
And so, but for me, when I was researching it, to me that was the invitation to let go of duality and see that all duality is actually just spectrums of one. And so it was really this letting go of all of those black and white thinking and extremes, and seeing, oh my God, like even fear and love are just two ends of one spectrum. Oh my gosh, that's one. And so to me it was this whole shift of reality that happened as a result of, and it was me stepping more into oneness even more so. But while I was sitting there, this is the honest God truth, like I was sitting there journaling about this very topic, and I'm just, thinking, feeling, we'll just say downloading, and this little tiny spider comes down about a foot in front of my face. It's a black, little tiny black spider. I'm like, oh, hey, little guy, and I kind of took my pen and put him on the ground, and I'm journaling, and again, I'm journaling about duality, which is what? It's black and white, right? Not 3 minutes later, a white spider, the same size and in the exact same place, about a foot from my face, comes down in front of me. And I was just like, is this really happening? And this is just one little synchronicity, but it's just like, if that would have happened at any other time in the journey, it would have been like, oh, that's neat. But like to happen when I am literally trying to release all of duality, it was pretty profound to me. That was a pretty spiritual experience.
What do you make of synchronicities like that? I know that Carl Jung has obviously written a lot about synchronicities, and I think even Joseph Campbell in some of his writing kind of talks about, maybe he doesn't use the same word, but he kind of references these kind of things. And I'm curious about, like, what's your own take on what synchronicity is? Is it just a random occurrence? Is it something we're making meaning out of? Is it a wink from the universe, as kind of Jim Carrey says? Like, what is that for you?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. So yeah, Carl Jung, he just says it's something that happens that means something to you, right? Like it's just some kind of, like to somebody else it might not mean anything, but to you it's really important. Now I'm going to take it way further than that. To me, again, when you've experienced oneness with everything, okay, to really experience that fully, you realize there's no separation, right? And that's what quantum physics also, talks about too. Everything is totally entangled. So, like for example, the air, all this space we see and we call air, there's actually not space. There's something filling every part of this. And when you've experienced that oneness, you recognize that you don't end where your skin ends. Like, if you're one with everything, like you essentially are everything and everything is you, and vice versa. It's kind of like the Beatles, right? Like, so to me, from my perspective, and this kind of brings in talk of what we call manifestation and different things like that. Manifestation to me is just, how do I communicate to myself from within my body to the version of me that's not in my body? And the version of me outside of this physical body is then giving me what it is, maybe not always what I want, but with synchronicities, oftentimes it's what I need. Sometimes it's what I want, and, that's what with manifestation we hope for. But even with manifestation, there is a sense of letting go. It's trusting that whatever comes to me is going to be for my best. Life is happening for me, for my growth, for my evolution. you know? And so to me, that's what a synchronicity is. It's actually you, the me outside of me, giving me that next little breadcrumb that I need to level up to whatever it might be, you know?
Yeah. To keep going down that path, like,
Exactly.
there's that sign that you're following the right step.
Exactly.
Yeah. Have you ever experienced like any sort of complete loss of faith or a period of atheism or like non-spirituality at any point?
I can't say that I ever have.
No? Okay.
Honestly, it's one of those things where even when I was in my darkest time, like and thinking about taking my own life and telling my former wife to take the gun and hide it so I couldn't find it, and you know those kind of things, like I've always known there's something bigger than me. Now, I didn't always have the same perspective that I have now, and I'll be honest with you, every perspective I hold is in an open hand. Because if I'm holding on and clenching onto anything, like I'm attaching to something and I'm not allowing myself to grow and learn and evolve, right? Like the only way we can truly evolve is in an open hand, you know, because I'm going to. Here's actually a metaphor that I often use with clients and friends, but it's like if life is kind of like a mountain, right? Now, I'm just going to, this sounds terrible. I'm going to put the Christians at base camp. Okay, no disrespect. But, you know, we'll just say, you know, I'm at base camp with all of these Christians, and they're like, oh, yeah, you know, these trees and everything we see, this is real. This is what's true. You know, this is reality. Now, if I go walk up a mile up the mountain, and I'm not now looking up at trees, but I'm looking down at the very trees that they were looking at, and I'm like, oh my God, this is a completely different reality than I thought it was. And I go back down and tell them, and they're like, you're wrong. That's not truth. That's not reality. It can't be. And so for me, it's like as we're climbing the mountain, we're gaining higher and higher perspectives. And so that's where the open hand comes in, because if I'm holding on to any part of that walk up the mountain, I'm going to get stuck, right? I'm going to get stuck. And then that's what we call a fixed mindset, right? It's not a growth mindset anymore. And the growth mindset, even in the research, that was one of the there's only two mindsets that really stuck out when healing the body. Number one was a growth mindset. You know, basically keeping everything in an open hand, you know, and if it resonates right now, awesome. But if it doesn't, as you learn something else, cool, toss it. We got a new one, you know. And the other one was surrendering expectancy. Okay, so it's like, to me, it's kind of like having an intention for what I desire, but then just trusting and letting go. I'm not focused on it. I'm just letting it go. Because it's like, truly, what is trust? It is letting go. Like if you said, hey, Blake, come on over and grab some pizza on the way. Now, if you trust me, you're not going to text me, call me, nothing. You're just going to look forward to having the pizza there. But if you don't trust me, right, you're going to be texting me, hey, did you get it? Oh, it's got to be picked up at this time. I really want a pepperoni, you know?
Yeah.
Right? And so letting go is synonymous with trust. You know, it's surrender, literally. You know, so that's where that whole surrendering expectancy, and that's what the research showed, was that it takes that kind of, I have an intention, but I need to let it go and trust. And just surrender to the outcome and trust that it's the best thing coming back for me for the next step, you know?
Yeah. How do you work on that ability to surrender? Because I think that's one thing that's like kind of, it's easy to talk about, or like there can be like, you know, guides around it. And I've had, you know, I can say from my own personal experience, I've had really profound manifestation experiences, and like to your point, like had that, and then where I had, you know, even with me, you know, working at 40 Years of Zen for a while, it was like this huge experience where I felt this gratitude for getting to go through that program before I was ever there. And I was kind of doing this visualization thing. And then I just kind of felt like this sort of piece of like, that's going to happen. And then like, I didn't know when. I figured it had happened like in a year or two or something like that. And then it was literally like 2 weeks later, I got like an email from them saying that they were like discounting the program for that period of time, and I was just getting a lump sum of money that like matched the amount that it was, and it was just like, this is like it. And that's why I like went and jumped and like, you know, took that journey for myself, and it led to all these other amazing things in my life, and I definitely know it can be really, really tricky to actually get in that state of surrender. Even when one of the things I learned, I think, a lot at festivals and stuff was I would have these amazing experiences that were so profound and amazing and cool. And then when I would go to the usually like the next festival, there's some part of my psyche going like, oh no, I'm not having an amazing experience. I'm not doing whatever. How do I get back to that place where I feel disconnected? And I'm like desiring that thing, but I have that attachment to it. And it's kind of harder to just like trust and get back in the moment. How do you personally, I guess, like develop that ability to surrender? How do you practice that?
God, that's such a great question. Um, well, I think maybe we'll start here. So to me, like our as any kind of a being, like our greatest gift and power is choice,
Hmm.
right? Like we have the opportunity and ability to choose anything at any moment. Like if I wanted to end this podcast right now, I could be like, "See ya," right? Like
Hmm.
I have a choice to do anything, but we have agreements, we have trust. So
Hmm.
like I wouldn't do that.
Thank you.
but the point here is like it doesn't stop there. So even trust, it starts with a choice. I have to choose it first. So often people think they have to feel it before they choose it or before they can, and that's just not accurate. It starts with choosing it first. And most times we've got to choose it over and over and over until then, secondly, it's a belief. Okay? So once I choose anything over and over and over enough, I can work on really holding on and believing it. And then finally, the third step is where it starts growing roots down into the body and into the emotions, where I can start feeling it. And then ultimately, fourth, we can become it, essentially, right? So we choose it, we believe it, we feel it, and then we can fully become it. And so, whether it's trust, forgiveness, love, pick a quality. Like all of that starts with a choice.
Hmm.
You know,
No.
is that helpful?
Yeah, I think so. I guess what I'm pondering or still kind of like a little stuck on is wondering about like the actual like letting go piece. So kind of what I heard from you is, we make the choice of, I don't know, desiring the thing that we want or going after it or that we want this thing or that we're moving towards
Mm-hmm.
something. And then we kind of cultivate that belief over time, right? And then there's like we kind of like can feel into that or develop a feeling of what that is like or what the association is. Or I used to go through this meditation that I really like what they would do where it's like, okay, how do you want to feel and like focusing on that feeling and like literally like letting energies or like visions or visualizations kind of come from that to guide you, but really tapping into that feeling.
Yeah.
Because I think even if you've done somebody who's done personal growth work and you've looked at even like Tony Robbins stuff or a lot of these different people, like fundamentally, like usually when we're wanting something, what we're actually craving is like the feeling that that thing is giving us. And so a lot of the personal growth experience or that kind of thing is basically, well, like how do you start feeling that thing now rather than like kind of having your life dictated by needing something external to feel that thing, because those feelings are generated from within, right?
Right.
And so learning to cultivate that feeling, and then I guess once you're cultivating that feeling, you're at that point, that's when you're just kind of trusting that feeling to be enough of it. Is that kind of what you're getting to?
In some ways, I guess you could say it that way. So maybe I should have said I'm just talking about self trust in general,
Mm.
right? Like trusting every moment that I'm capable of handling whatever it is. But then, like we said, if we're all one, that self trust doesn't end where this physical
Mm.
body is. So literally, I'm trusting myself outside of myself, right? So that's what I am saying in terms of the choosing, believing, feeling, becoming. That's the ultimate goal: is to fully embody self trust. Now, on the day to day kind of a thing, um, personally, I do kind of just like, well, first of all, we've got to get out of our heads. Like, that's number one. We cannot be in our minds to be able to do this.
Mm-hmm.
We've got to kind of drop our attention down into our bodies, you know? And so oftentimes what I'll say for people is take two fingers, just put it on the middle of your chest here, and I want you to feel your fingers on your chest, but then also from the other perspective, what is your chest feeling from your fingers? Where's your attention right in that moment?
Yeah, I mean, for me, it's on, I guess that the interconnection of it, like where they're both like feeling each other, essentially.
Yes, but it wasn't in your mind,
Mm.
right? We're dropping the attention down here into our body. That's step one. We have to get our attention out of our mind and into our body. So then from there, for me, it's almost like a feeling like I'm taking off a robe or something, and it's dropping to the floor.
Mm.
And it's literally energetically, I can feel it moving out of my body, usually from my core out, and it's this literally this creating this free, empty, airy place in my body, just and filling my whole body with it. So that's
Mm.
kind of like the energetic practice of it. Because I don't think there's any perfect way for everybody. For
Hmm.
me, that's what I feel, and I feel completely open and free and connected. When I'm able to remember just to do that throughout the day, and just like,
Hmm.
okay, just letting it go, and it's almost like I'm taking something off and just dropping it to the
Yeah.
floor.
Yeah.
Um,
Hmm.
I don't know. Is that something that you've ever tried or heard of? Is explained in that way?
I've never heard it explained exactly like that, but I've definitely experienced various things like that, or practiced various kind of meditation or spiritual practices that are like that. So it does make sense to me functionally. Yeah.
Yeah. So that's kind of the third step, is where we're continuing to step into the embody,
Hmm.
literally, that self-trust of
Hmm.
just being open and free and to receive,
Hmm.
you know. But the mind, that's the second step, right? So that's where, we're choosing to believe life is happening for me,
Hmm.
and I don't have anything to fear. It's nothing separate.
Hmm.
It's happening for me. Like, so even if something hard happens, like, it's there to teach me how to get to that next step,
Hmm.
you know? And if
Yeah.
for some reason I decide I don't want to do that one, another one's going to come up. You will eventually graduate third grade no matter what. We can't fail, right? Like, it's just, we will get there,
Yeah.
So,
Yeah.
yeah. But hopefully that's helpful.
Yeah, yeah, no, I think it is. I kind of wanted to drill back a little bit when you were talking about like your own, experiencing that oneness. Are you open to sharing like what was the, and maybe you experienced like on multiple different things, but what was like the first time you really experienced that? Was that through like your ayahuasca journey? Was it from something in particular before that? Like what was your first experience of oneness, and what was that actually like for you?
Yeah. Well, and I think prefacing this, for me, I'm up to this point, I had never smoked marijuana. I'd never done any recreational drugs, nothing like that. But like I said, plant medicine called me, and it presented itself to me in the form of mushrooms. And this was I did three mushroom journeys. The third one is when I experienced oneness.
Hmm.
Um, and they were definitely inner work journeys. It's not like taking mushrooms and going to a party.
Right.
Like, it was something that was deliberate, intentional. Um,
Did you
and
have like
so
a guide or a facilitator with you? Or was it like a heavy dose, kind of light dose? Like, what was
at
your?
that time, I didn't have any kind of a guide or anything. Like,
Mhm.
and I'm not going to say I suggest that. I
Sure.
think that having a guide, you will find greater results so much faster. Someone who understands what they're doing. Um, but at that time, I did not. I took like a 4 gram dose, and so it's a pretty heavy dose. Um, but it's so funny. Like, I remember kind of when the journey started. I was laying on my back and like starting to kind of experience the sensation of colors and all the things, and it was almost like this portal opened up in front of me,
Hmm.
and someone on the other side kind of reached their hand out to me and was like, "Hey, do you want to take this journey?" And now,
Hmm.
truth is, for me, And it's funny, I've shared this with other people too, but the medicine has always talked to me. I've always had conversations. Like it's always been my guide. And so like it kind of guided me, we'll just say all the way through the different dimensions and densities all the way to oneness is what it was.
Mm.
It felt like. And once I got there, and I would say that was kind of my awakening
Yeah.
moment of remembering who we are. Like I felt it, I remembered it, and I remember asking the guide, the medicine, like how many times have I woken up?
Hmm.
Like, and the medicine just was like, you ask that every time. And I just laughed so hard, literally for like 30 minutes. Of course, the mushrooms help with that. But yeah, that was the first time, and it was just, um, yeah, there, just feeling there was no separation, and how everything is connected, and yeah, it was incredible.
Yeah.
And now, after practice, to me, like the those medicine journeys give you a glimpse into a greater awareness.
Mhm.
But it's still on us to practice and
Mhm.
put into practice that awareness that we gained during those medicine journeys. So, for example, when I'm working with individuals, I talk a lot about identity because that, to me, is kind of your overall quote unquote frequency. Okay, so if you are experiencing a lot of fear, mentally, emotionally, like physically, like you're in the frequency of fear, if you will. But in these plant medicine journeys, we're working to shift those frequencies, or we could just say in psychology terms, your identity.
Mm.
So you're shifting out of that fear identity into more forgiveness,
Right.
acceptance, gratitude, love, freedom. Like, and we can just keep going. And so to me, it can help someone go through that whole process of identity shifts in so much faster, but you still have to do the work, you
Yeah.
know?
Yeah. No, it makes me think of like we were talking about perspective earlier, right? It's almost like this ability to go above onto the mountain for a minute and say, "Hey, here's what's here," right? And like you have to work then to get back there. But like you had that experience, and so you know something is like deeper and true. Like I think even for me, the first time I feel like I had one of those experiences was, strangely enough, even though again I'm not supporting the use of alcohol per se, but was one of the times that I was first exploring with alcohol and got like fairly drunk and but like still fairly lucid, but was like, oh, like this other part of me is coming out that I kind of wish I was a lot more. Like why is it? Because if I can be that way when I'm drunk, I'm sure I can be that way without it, right? And so it gave me this kind of like this openness to like some other part of myself that I
Yes.
wanted to be that I had a hard time being for some reason. I couldn't quite figure out why, and that led me to go to therapy and led me to go to other things as well, like across my journey. But it was that oneness, that openness to experience, and that wasn't an experience of oneness, but that experience of something different that opened my mind up to that. And it reminds me, I was talking a little earlier of Mike Israetel, and he was sharing about his like experience with ADHD. It was very crippling for him, and how when he got onto Adderall, he went to from like being a flunking student to like getting a scholarship to, going to the school and like realizing it was, and then the medication stopped working for him. It started giving him a lot of anxiety, and so he had to like figure out how to do it basically without the medication. And over time, figured out how to actually like build his attention up, build all these different pieces of himself up because he knew what was there somewhere, right? There was some way for him to be this way, and I do feel like those perspective shifts, even if they are only for a moment or a glimpse, can be so powerful and profound for us because we know there's something else out there that we can reach or achieve or experience.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Mm. Hmm. Yeah. Yeah, sorry. I kind of was thinking a couple things at the same time you were talking, so
No, you're
I
good. You're
was
good.
I was floating. I don't know. I
Yeah.
was kind of thinking about this idea of the fear frequency and how someone listening to this might not quite understand my definition of fear. And
Sure.
to me, it is separation. It's that I'm afraid that I'm going to be hurt by somebody else or whatever. It's seeing everything as so separate. Where love is this desire for unity.
Hmm.
And once you kind of experience that oneness of love through everything, it's like, and you start practicing that in your, dropping again your attention down to your heart chakra and experiencing in the body, and that connection to everything, and that connection is love. And like, if you've never experienced that, but I remember, I guess what brought me to that was thinking, if there was a Christian listening to this episode, like, I always thought that I was in love and experiencing that, when I didn't realize that I was experiencing fear. Because if there has to be someone better or someone worse, and we're not all equal, and like everyone, like that, when there isn't unity, there isn't love.
Yeah.
And so, sorry, I totally took
No.
that a different way,
No.
but I just, sorry, I kind of have
Oh
a
no, you're
little
totally
bit.
good. I wasn't going there with any particular like intent or anything. It was more just
Yeah,
sharing, and I think that's great. And I would actually really love to drill down into that even more so, because you mentioned earlier, one of the things that started happening for you as you were a Christian counselor was basically it sounded like the experience from your clients, and like hearing their experiences as well. I'm sure dealing with your own like within the church was a big part of what led you to like leave the church. And I was wondering, if I know you obviously have to respect confidentiality and such, but like what kind of things were you seeing that made you start questioning or saying, hey, maybe there's something else going on here that's not so great, or that I need to separate myself from this to find something different or better? Like what were you seeing or hearing, or what was that like for you?
yeah. Well, so in cognitive behavioral therapy, okay, CBT, that's like one of the gold standards for counseling. If you ever go to counseling, they're probably going to talk about CBT. In CBT, they have this list of the top 10 cognitive distortions. Okay? Cognitive distortions meaning problematic thinking patterns. Okay? And so this was something I was trained in, and I was practicing myself to step out of those. But the number one that is on the page is black and white thinking, all or nothing thinking. And again, what is that? That is what we were talking about with the devil card. It's, we're sitting in duality, of this right or wrong or good or bad. When if we can kind of bring all that together into oneness and unity, all of that duality, all that black and white thinking, all the all or nothing thinking, all of that, we feel such a calm and peace inside. And that's what I was helping people with over and over and over in this experience of perfectionism, right? Because it's kind of like that is the root as well. It ties right into black and white thinking, and it's like, I have to either be perfect or I'm a failure. And so, but we know we can't be perfect up here, but there's a disconnect. I feel like I still should be. And so we've got this bar so high that we will never reach, and so we live our entire lives feeling like we're less than, we're not enough, right? And that not enoughness was what I was seeing over and over and over and over. And I was just like, this, number one, it's not healthy for these people. They're experiencing a lot of disease, and just, it was miserable, right? And so that was the very thing that it was just like I was coming to this awareness of just seeing this over and over. And then how in the church, this was in some ways, it's so hard, because unless you've experienced it yourself being in the Christian church, it's like they may say that it's like, you don't have to be perfect. You don't have to be these things. But then at the same time, you're judged for it by everybody you're around. If
Yeah.
you've got an issue, you tend to be just judged, like, why haven't you figured this out yet?
Yeah.
And so it's an amazing place for community, but for healing, I didn't find that was the greatest place for healing.
Yeah. Well, it's such an interesting dichotomy. And what came up for me as you were talking about it was when, I was in the church, it was a lot of like, okay, yeah, like everybody like sins and you make mistakes and you do these things and you ask for forgiveness, and like you're never going to be perfect, you're always going to be imperfect, but at the same time, to your point, it's like you're meant to be striving for perfection in some way, right? And then it becomes this thing of like, well, all you have to do is like, ask God to forgive you and you're saved and like you're good. But like, if you keep doing the thing, then maybe you're not really asking for repentance, so you're not actually doing the thing right. And so it becomes this like endless game of like suffering where you're like kind of walking on this like spiritual eggshells in a sense of like, am I doing the right thing? Have I repented enough times? Have I actually made the change, or do I just have to like make sure I ask for forgiveness one last time right before I die and before I can fuck up again? Like, what
Yeah,
if I forget?
exactly.
Right? There's like so much like existential dread that starts going on in the brain. Um,
And think about
that
how much fear that is right
it's a
there. Just
ton.
right.
Yeah.
Like it's this constant fear that I'm not enough and feeling.
Hmm.
So anyway, to your point, but yeah.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I guess what I'm wondering when as you're seeing this like in clients, and I'm sure like on some level you're seeing that maybe reflected in your own psyche with some of these other pieces, like how did that start to like shift your I don't know your perspective around God or the church or like those kinds of things at that time? Because it obviously led you to leaving, and you said you like still have your own spirituality, and you've never really it didn't lead you to like, oh, okay, there's just like no God, this is all just like bullshit or quackery. So like how did that shift things for you, and like what started to change in that moment?
Yeah. So the way that I'm going to answer this might seem roundabout, but it's
Yeah.
all going to tie together. Okay. Remember how I talked about those three phases of healing your body?
Hmm.
Okay. To me, those three phases also represent our human evolution, our individual human evolution too, along with our collective. So it's like we start out with the emotional brain, right? And it's all based on safety and survival. There's a lot of fear, right? Our entire emotional system in the amygdala is in that part of the brain, right? And as we are able to manage our emotional brain, it allows us to connect to the Wi-Fi for our thinking brain, right? And if we're not thinking clearly, that's probably the first thing we should do is, am I fully dealing with and releasing my emotions so that I can calm down my amygdala and think more clearly? So, step one is getting out of fear. Step two is getting into the mind. Now, this is where I see uh, it's kind of like let's parallel this back to spirituality and religion for a second. This was all hedonistic when we were in the emotional brain, and that was kind of that's where we started, right? It was kind of hedonism, and then we go into religion. That's all about the mind. It's understanding. It's logic. It's there's got to be this right? Okay. To me, that's step two. That's phase two. It's part of the process. There's nothing wrong with it. There's nothing bad about it. It's just everyone is going to eventually work through from the emotional brain into the thinking brain, just like we will in some ways in religion. And then we're working to drop down into the intuitive divine heart. To me, this is again where you're going to find spirituality. So we're going from religion to experience, but understanding, quote unquote, God, to experiencing God in the body. That's spirituality, right? And that's emotional because that's what our body is. Like that's the memory of our body is emotion, And this ties right back into trauma, and the body keeps a score, and all those things, right? So it is this literally, and that's why my brand is called Vital Evolution. We're evolving out of the animal into the human, into the divine. And we're working on that evolution individually right now, but also collectively. And so the more individuals that do, right, like collectively, it's going to shift us. So, so again, to me, it's not good or bad, right or wrong. It's just part of the process.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, what I heard in that I think is interesting is, it almost sounds like the heart is where like kind of that synthesis of these two dualities like come, right? So you kind of on one side you could say like here's like hedonism and pleasure and fear and like all of the kind of physical sensational components, right? And then over here you have like the intellectual understanding, the maybe like the righteousness in a sense where there's like here's a better way of doing things or whatever, right? But then like neither one of these paths in and of themselves are the right way. And then when you're kind of connected to your heart, which again for anybody listening is something you can actually like practice, like if you look into like heart coherence, if you look into some of these things, like they can be really really profound. And we know that your heart basically has its own like neural clusters or its own brain that actually communicates not just from your brain down but from your heart up. And so you can actually, there's a lot of songs that talk about like listening to your heart, and this is an actual like thing that you can do and practice.
Yeah.
And it sounds like from your perspective that like that listening to that heart and like being guided by that intuition is like that synthesis of these other two parts of ourselves in a sense, or these other two lines in a sense.
And it ties in so many other aspects too, okay? Because you can't think your way into self-trust. You have to experience it. And that's through trusting your intuition too. That's part of the journey of self-trust. If you're not listening to your own intuition and acting on it and really trying to understand that intuitive center, instead of just listening to the emotions, and so also differentiating what is an emotion and what is an intuition. Like that's also self-trust building part of this too. So again, there's a lot of different pieces, but ultimately, yes, I believe that this is where we experience that connection to everything. Okay?
Yeah. Do you have a story that you like personally where you experience like a profound sense of self-trust?
Oh God, I mean, I think it's something in a lot of ways I have to choose every day, especially when I got diagnosed with cancer. It was just like telling my oncologist I wasn't going to take the medication because I just knew I wasn't supposed to, or like saying I don't know why, but I know I need to leave, and I'm going to go to Sedona, Arizona. I don't even know what Sedona is or why, but I know I need to go there. I need to go to Peru. Like I started listening to those intuitive callings, and like the tarot, like that was another intuition, and it was just like I don't know where they're coming from, quote unquote. Like I didn't understand them then. Now I feel like I've got a better understanding, but it's just I think it is something that the more you listen, the more it communicates, you know? And it's, if you think about it, everything really is relationship. If everything is interconnected, everything is relationship. And so, like, to me, kind of the two most powerful experiences in life are love and trust. And if we're not striving for both of those, we're going to be missing the mark. You know, and we're not going to live a fulfilled life. You know, if we're not experiencing self-love, self-trust, but then usually that'll just ripple out into loving others and trusting others. And, you know, but those are the two biggest things. I mean, if we're striving towards those, but again, it's a process. But that's, again, what the tarot showed me, you know? And so it's like, is that the only path? Absolutely not. You know, it's just kind of like diets, you know. Does everyone need the same diet? No. We have individual bodies that need different things. And that's why diets don't, I mean, you can look at all the research even for cancer. You know, you could say, oh, no, this is the diet you need for cancer. It's going to help you. And it's just like, no, you need to listen and create a relationship with your body through your intuition. That's self-trust. That's creating the relationship with our bodies so that we can fully step into wholeness. So, yeah.
Yeah. That's great.
Going on here.
No, that's great. What's a way that, like a simple way that you would recommend somebody can practice like developing that ability to listen to their intuition? If maybe they're not connected to that before, they've never, intentionally listened to their intuition in some way, or maybe they're like, okay, if it's not emotions, that is intuition, like what is it? Like, how would you, if you were going to start somebody from ground zero and like give them a simple practice or a simple thing to do, like what would that be?
Yeah. Well, it's a really hard thing to answer that specifically. Number one, because it's not ground level, right? We said that's still phase 3. That's the third step. And it's kind of like we can't jump past the first two. If you cannot manage your own emotions and know how to release emotions in your body to be able to calm down your animal, literally taming your own animal, and if you don't know how to step into full acceptance and just surrender in your own mind, we're going to have a hard time coming down into the body to be able to hear what it has to say. Because we're going to hear the emotion, we're going to feel the emotions, and that's going to lead us through emotional reasoning, or we're going to lead with rationality and logic, Now, that doesn't mean that our heart is always illogical, but there's times that it's not going to be logical. It's not going to be rational. I mean, it's just kind of like, I just know I can't go there tonight. And when you find out something terrible happens or whatever it is, you're like, it's not rational, like,
Hmm.
but it's connected. And so it's learning that communication. But we can't do it if the radio signals are, we're getting all these other stations, if that
Yeah.
makes sense.
Yeah. So first thing is like be before you could even get there, making sure that you're able to calm the emotional centers, like feel relaxed, safe in your own body, in your own
Yep.
state, right? And then being able to maybe through something like meditation, like being able to calm the mind, being able to still that, being able to be present, or even just connecting with nature in some way, right? And then from there, it sounds like the third piece is really something that almost more opens up when those two are kind of relaxed finally, when they're able to settle down rather
Yeah.
than be guiding the ship.
Yeah, exactly. And I know this might be a terrible analogy, but it's like you wouldn't go straight to Major League Football without playing Pee Wee and high school and all. You wouldn't be ready for it,
Hmm.
right? And so it's just like you have to grow and develop through those processes. And again, that's why it's vital evolution. It's your own individual evolution,
Hmm.
you know. But as we all step into that individual evolution collectively, we're changing the world,
Hmm.
you know?
Yeah, beautiful. Well, Blake, this has been a really cool conversation. One question I always have for my guests at the end of the show is, what's one question that you might have for them that might shift their perspective or give them something to think about in a new way?
Good question. Um, I think the first part of any change is number one, being open to it, right? But number two, creating just awareness, self awareness. And so, like, recognizing, okay, if I always talk to people about this 5 stage of identity shift, and there's more to it, but this is kind of the first couple steps. But we start out in fear. And again, this all goes along straight with the brain and everything else we were just talking about, right?
Hmm.
Um, and it's like we're in this fear identity. I hope that I am, right? I am being identity, but I fear that I am not, right? I hope that I'm loving, but I'm afraid I'm not. I hope that I am this, but I'm afraid I'm not. We start out in this identity. So, in order to go to the next one, we have to work through self forgiveness. That's the next one. So, it's I am forgiven. Now, that's a very Christian religious way of thinking about it, but it's basically a way of am I able to let go of all of my emotional attachments to my past? That's the step 2. Step 3 is stepping into full acceptance of who I am right now, knowing that I'm both positive and negative. I'm all of that, and that's okay. There's nothing wrong with that's actually good. If we were only one or the other, it doesn't create motion. We don't grow. We don't learn. We don't evolve. We need both positive and negative to learn, to grow, to evolve. So it's fully embracing all of who you are. Step 4 is where I say we're stepping into self gratitude. And it's not, we kind of think gratitude is just everything outside of us. But honestly, everything flows from the inside out. Okay? And so it's fully being grateful for us, ourselves. And then we can finally step into self love. So, my question then that I would just invite people into is where are you in your identity shifts? If you're in fear, that's okay. That's just part of the process. Everyone starts there. That's not right or wrong or good or bad. But just recognize that and just embrace the journey. You know, it's a fun journey, it's a hard journey, but totally worth it. you know,
Hmm.
and then gosh, there's just so much more. Like that's just the first couple stages, and then it can just become magical.
Beautiful. Like this has been great, and I think it's a fantastic question to end on. Where can people find out more about you or follow you if they want to be tuned to more of your stuff?
Yeah, so very soon I'm going to be launching Vital Evolution. I haven't fully gotten everything up and running yet, but I do have BlakeSuzelis.com is where you can find out some things. Live Lucky Therapy is actually another thing that I offer. It's a self-guided approach to therapy. If you're like, I don't know if I want to work with anybody, it's $30 a month, super cheap. You know, it's a book and workbook, and you get weekly videos to help you through this journey of identity shift. And so those are a couple of ways, but yeah, soon it'll be Vital Evolution. So that's what's coming.
Great. Awesome. Blake, well, this has been awesome. We'll have to talk again soon.
Yeah, thanks so much, Cam. I really appreciate you.
Yeah, of course. Same here. All right. Ciao.